I found the folder by accident, looking for a tax document on our shared cloud drive, a folder labeled simply, Project Aria. Inside were nearly 6 years of my own text messages, voice memos, journal entries I'd only ever shared with him, and transcripts of arguments I remembered having in the privacy of our own bedroom, all organized, tagged, and time-stamped with a precision that made my stomach drop before I even understood what I was looking at. My name is Nicole. I'm 33 years old, and 4 months before what was supposed to be our wedding, I discovered that my fiancé, Adam, had spent the better part of 3 years quietly compiling nearly every private conversation, argument, and vulnerable moment of our relationship into a structured dataset, used, without my knowledge or consent, to train an AI chatbot he was secretly building into a commercial product with a small team of investors who had no idea that the personality data powering their product's most impressive demo had actually been harvested from his own real, unsuspecting fiancé. This isn't a story about a partner who simply recorded us without asking. It's a story about a startup, a pitch deck, a group of investors who'd already wired money based on a product built on my own stolen intimacy, and the specific, cold mechanics of exactly how someone turns years of shared vulnerability into a commercial asset without the person living inside that vulnerability ever finding out. I met Adam 5 years ago, through a mutual friend at a tech industry mixer neither of us particularly wanted to attend. And what drew me to him initially was a specific, easy intelligence. He worked as a machine learning engineer at a mid-sized software company, genuinely passionate about his field in a way that made even fairly technical conversations feel accessible and interesting rather than alienating. We moved in together after 1.5 years, and our relationship, from the inside, felt like exactly the kind of steady, communicative partnership I'd always hoped to build. We talked things through directly, we didn't shy away from difficult conversations. And I remember, more than once during our engagement, telling friends that one of the things I valued most about Adam was how genuinely present he seemed during even our hardest, most vulnerable conversations, always asking thoughtful follow-up questions, always seeming to remember specific details from things I'd shared with him months or even years earlier. I remember, specifically, a conversation roughly 2 years into our relationship, during a particularly difficult period following my father's health scare, when Adam sat with me for hours one evening, asking careful, genuinely engaged questions about how I was processing everything, questions that felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of attentive partnership I'd always hoped to find. I told my closest friend, Priya, about that conversation the following week, describing Adam as the most emotionally present person I've ever dated, a description I repeated, in some form, to multiple friends across the following years, never once suspecting the specific, additional purpose that attentiveness may have been quietly serving all along. I understand now, with the benefit of everything I eventually learned, exactly how chilling that specific quality actually was, viewed through its true context. What felt, for years, like exceptional attentiveness and emotional presence was, at least in part, the visible surface of a considerably colder, more calculated project running underneath our entire relationship. Adam wasn't simply present during our difficult conversations. He was, I would eventually learn, actively gathering material. Adam left his stable engineering job roughly 3 years into our relationship to pursue what he described to me, and to our friends and family, as an independent AI consulting venture, a transition I supported enthusiastically at the time. Genuinely excited to see him pursue something he was passionate about outside the constraints of a large company. I had no idea, during those years of watching him build what I believed was a legitimate, independent consulting business, that the actual core product he was quietly developing behind that consulting facade was an AI companion chatbot, and that the specific, remarkably convincing personality data powering its most impressive capabilities had been extracted, systematically, from the private architecture of our own relationship. There's one specific incident from roughly 2 years into our relationship that I've returned to often since, because in hindsight, it represented an early, missed opportunity to understand what was actually happening, one I dismissed entirely at the time. Adam had asked me, during a quiet evening at home, whether I'd mind if he used our old phone as a testing device for some work-related software he said he was developing, mentioning something vague about needing a phone that could run in the background continuously without interfering with either of our primary devices. I agreed without much thought, genuinely uninterested in the technical specifics of his professional work, which I'd always found more his domain than mine. That phone, would eventually learn, sat charging discreetly in a kitchen drawer for the following several months, running a background application Adam had built specifically to passively record ambient audio during periods he determined, through some analysis of our typical schedules, were most likely to produce genuinely unguarded conversation. I remember, at the time, occasionally noticing that phone was oddly warm to the touch when I happened to open that drawer, a detail I dismissed then as simply an old device's battery running down from whatever background task Adam had mentioned, never once suspecting what that background task actually was. I want to walk through exactly what I found in that folder, because the specificity of it matters enormously to understanding the scope of what Adam had actually built over those 3 years. Project Aria contains several structured subfolders, organized with the same methodical precision Adam brought to his professional engineering work. One subfolder, labeled Conversational Corpus, contained what appeared to be complete, searchable transcripts of years of our text message history, exported and formatted in a structured data format I didn't immediately recognize but would later learn was a standard format used for training conversational AI models. Another subfolder, labeled Emotional Response Patterns, contained transcribed audio recordings of specific conversations and arguments, several of which I remembered having in what I'd believed, at the time, was the complete privacy of our own bedroom, tagged with emotional category labels: conflict de-escalation, vulnerability disclosure, affection expression, that read, to me, like a cold, clinical taxonomy applied retroactively to some of the most intimate, unguarded moments of my adult life. A third subfolder contained what looked like voice memo recordings, dozens of them, spanning back nearly 3 years, none of which I had any memory of consenting to or even being aware were being made. I opened one, at random, my hands shaking, and heard my own voice, from what I could tell was roughly 2 years earlier, having a quiet, vulnerable conversation with Adam about a difficult period with my mother, a conversation I remembered clearly as having happened in our own kitchen, late at night, with no phone or recording device visible anywhere near us at the time. I sat on our kitchen floor for what felt like hours after that discovery, scrolling through file after file, each one representing a specific memory I'd believed belonged only to the two of us, now revealed to have existed, the entire time, as raw material being fed into something I didn't yet fully understand. It took me several more hours of careful, methodical searching through that same shared drive to understand the actual scope of what Adam had built with this material, and what I found reframed the entire discovery from a deeply invasive privacy violation into something considerably larger and more calculated. Buried several folders deep, I found a polished, professional pitch deck, dated roughly 8 months earlier, describing a product called Aria, an AI companion chatbot designed, according to the deck's own marketing language, to offer uniquely authentic, emotionally intelligent conversation through what the deck described as a proprietary training methodology involving real, longitudinal human relationship data, rather than the generic, scraped internet text most competing AI companion products relied on. The deck included sample conversation transcripts demonstrating the product's capabilities, several of which I recognized, with a specific, sickening jolt, as directly lifted phrasing and conversational patterns from my own actual text messages to Adam, repurposed as demonstration dialogue for potential investors. I found, in a separate folder, a series of email threads with what appeared to be 3 different investors, spanning several months, discussing funding terms, a product roadmap, and a planned public beta launch scheduled for just 2 months after the date I discovered all of this, timed, I would later realize with a particular kind of horror, only weeks after our planned wedding date. I remember reading through those investor emails with a specific, growing horror at the language Adam used to describe our relationship in purely instrumental, technical terms, language entirely disconnected from anything resembling the partnership I believed we'd been building together. One email, addressed to a potential investor, described the training data's unusually rich longitudinal depth, spanning multiple significant relationship milestones including cohabitation and engagement, language that made our actual, lived engagement, a milestone I'd cried happy tears over, that we'd celebrated with both of our families, sound like nothing more than a convenient data collection opportunity Adam had recognized and exploited in real time as it happened. I want to describe the specific quality of dread that built as I understood the actual scope of this project, because it moved considerably beyond a personal, private violation between 2 partners. Adam hadn't simply used our private conversations for some strange, isolated personal project. He had built an entire commercial venture, with real investors and real money already committed, whose core, marketable value proposition depended directly on training data harvested, without my knowledge or consent, from years of my own most private, unguarded moments that I didn't confront Adam that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters for understanding the specific, careful process I went through before deciding how to handle what I'd found. I recognized, almost immediately, that whatever Adam had built involved not just our relationship, but active investors, a functioning company, and legal questions considerably beyond my own personal understanding of privacy or consent law. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I said anything to him directly. I called an attorney the following morning, a careful, direct practitioner named Sandra Nguyen who specializes in technology and data privacy law, a specialty I hadn't previously had any reason to know existed, but that turned out to be exactly what this situation required. I described, as clearly as I could manage given how disoriented I still felt, everything I'd found: the transcripts, the voice memos, the pitch deck, the investor communications. Sandra explained something to me in that first consultation that reframed the entire legal shape of what I was dealing with. She told me that the specific audio recordings I'd found, made in private spaces without my knowledge or consent, likely violated our state's wiretapping and electronic surveillance statute, since our state, like a considerable number of others, requires all-party consent for recording private conversations. Meaning Adam's recording of our conversations without my knowledge constituted a criminal offense independent of anything he'd subsequently done with those recordings. She also explained that the broader use of my personal data, conversational patterns, and likeness to train a commercial AI product raised separate, additional legal questions around unauthorized commercial use of personal data and potential misappropriation of likeness, an emerging and rapidly evolving area of law given how recently AI training practices of this kind had become commercially significant. Sandra was candid that some of these specific legal theories remained less thoroughly tested in court than more established areas of law, but that the sheer volume and clearly non-consensual nature of what Adam had done gave us, in her professional assessment, a genuinely strong foundation to pursue both civil and, given the recording statute violation specifically, potential criminal consequences. What followed over the next several weeks was a careful, methodical process of documentation. Conducted with Sandra's guidance, designed to preserve evidence before Adam had any reason to suspect I'd discovered what he'd built, since Sandra was clear that any premature confrontation risked giving him the opportunity to delete or obscure critical evidence before we'd fully documented the scope of what existed. I made complete, time-stamped copies of every file in the Project Aria folder, working carefully during hours when Adam was reliably out of the apartment, cross-referencing what I found against my own memory of specific conversations and dates to build as complete a picture as possible of exactly how far back this project actually extended. Sandra's own investigator, a specialist in digital forensics she brought in specifically for cases involving this kind of technical evidence, helped establish a verified, defensible chain of custody for everything I'd found, ensuring the evidence would hold up to the scrutiny it would eventually need to survive in any legal proceeding. That forensic review revealed something that expanded my understanding of the project's scope even further. The investigator found evidence that Adam's data collection hadn't been limited to our direct conversations. He had also, apparently, extracted and incorporated years of my own private journal entries, accessed through a journaling app one use that synced to our shared home computer, entries I had never once shared with Adam directly and had specifically, deliberately kept private even within our relationship, precisely because they contained thoughts and reflections I hadn't been ready to share with anyone, including him. The investigator also uncovered something considerably more technical that Sandra explained mattered enormously to our case's overall strength: a detailed development log Adam had apparently kept throughout the project, documenting his own technical process and decision-making across nearly 3 years. That log, likely never intended for anyone else's eyes, included candid notes about specific data collection decisions, at one point explicitly noting his own awareness that expanding data collection to include my private journal meant crossing a line she'd definitely object to if she knew, a phrase Sandra described as devastating evidence of Adam's clear, contemporaneous understanding that what he was doing lacked, and would continue to lack, my consent. I want to describe the specific, distinct quality of violation that discovery produced. Separate from everything else I'd already learned. The conversations and arguments Adam had recorded, invasive as they were, had at least occurred within our shared relationship, however deceptively. The journal entries were different. Those were thoughts I had never spoken aloud to anyone, deliberately, specifically kept private even from the person I was planning to marry, and Adam had accessed and incorporated them into his commercial product anyway, without ever once indicating he even had access to them at all. Sandra's investigation into the broader scope of Adam's venture revealed something I hadn't fully anticipated, that the 3 investors named in those email threads were real, identifiable individuals and firms. 2 of whom had already wired substantial funding based specifically on the product demonstrations built using my own private data, demonstrations Adam had presented to them as evidence of the product's uniquely authentic conversational capabilities. Sandra reached out, through formal legal channels, to notify these investors of the actual, non-consensual source of the training data underlying the product they'd funded, a notification that produced immediate, significant consequences for Adam's venture that I hadn't fully anticipated. One investor, a small angel investment firm, immediately froze all further funding disbursements and began its own internal review of the situation, concerned about both the ethical and the substantial legal liability implications of having funded a product built on non-consensually harvested personal data. A second investor withdrew entirely within the week, citing what his own attorney described, in a letter Sandra later obtained through the discovery process, as an unacceptable level of legal exposure given the clear consent violations involved. I learned, through this same process, that Adam had specifically misrepresented the source of his training data to these investors, describing it in his pitch materials as aggregated, fully consented longitudinal relationship data, collected through what he'd characterized, falsely, as a formal research partnership with unnamed academic collaborators. This specific misrepresentation, Sandra explained, potentially exposed Adam to additional liability for fraud against his own investors, entirely separate from the privacy violations against me directly, since he had apparently lied not just to me, but to the very people whose money he was actively using to build this venture. Sandra's investigation also uncovered the specific due diligence questions the third investor, a larger, more established venture fund, had asked Adam directly during their evaluation process regarding data provenance and consent, questions Adam had apparently answered with carefully worded, technically evasive language designed to avoid outright lying while still creating a false overall impression of full compliance. Sandra described this pattern as particularly damaging to Adam's position once it came to light, since it demonstrated a level of premeditated, deliberate care in constructing his deception that went well beyond simple carelessness or a rushed, thoughtless decision made under startup pressure. Roughly 2 weeks after Sandra's formal notification reached the investors, I received an unexpected, direct phone call from the founding partner of the angel investment firm that had frozen its funding, a woman named Elaine Whitcomb, who told me she felt a personal obligation to speak with me directly, separate from whatever formal legal correspondence was passing between our respective attorneys. Elaine told me she'd spent considerable time reviewing the actual product demonstrations Adam had shown her firm during their initial pitch meetings, demonstrations she'd found, at the time, genuinely remarkable for how naturally, convincingly human the AI's responses felt compared to competing products her firm had evaluated. She said learning the true source of that authenticity had deeply unsettled her, not only because of the legal liability it created for her firm, but because of what she described as a broader, unresolved question the entire AI industry was still failing to adequately answer: how training data actually gets sourced, and how rarely investors, in her experience, pushed hard enough on that specific question before committing significant funding. She told me, near the end of that call, that her firm intended to implement a formal, expanded due diligence requirement specifically addressing training data provenance for any future AI-related investment, a policy change she said was directly prompted by what had happened in Adam's case. I found a strange, unexpected measure of comfort in that detail, a concrete, structural change resulting from what had happened to me, even amid everything else that call couldn't undo or repair. That I confronted Adam roughly 6 weeks after my initial discovery, once Sandra and I had assembled sufficient documentation to ensure the confrontation itself wouldn't compromise the evidence we'd already carefully preserved. I arranged for the conversation to happen with Sandra's guidance on what to say and, critically, what not to say, given the ongoing legal process already underway. I laid out what I'd found on our kitchen table, printed excerpts from the Project Aria folder, the pitch deck, screenshots of the investor correspondence. Adam's reaction moved through a sequence I've since heard described, by Sandra, as fairly typical in cases involving this kind of long-sustained deception: an initial, brief attempt at minimization, framing the recordings as something he'd meant to ask permission for eventually, followed, once the sheer scope of evidence in front of him made that framing impossible to sustain, by a more genuine, if still deeply inadequate, attempt to explain the actual timeline and reasoning behind what he'd built. He told me the project had started, in his own account, nearly 3 years earlier, as what he initially described as a personal, private experiment, building a small language model fine-tuned on our own text conversations, initially just to see, out of genuine technical curiosity, whether he could create something that captured my specific conversational patterns and personality convincingly. He said this initial version had never been intended for any commercial purpose, and that the recordings and journal access had begun, in his account, gradually, as he found himself wanting increasingly rich, detailed training data to improve the model's accuracy and specificity. He told me the transition to an actual commercial venture had happened roughly a year later, once he'd shown an early version of the model to a friend with startup investment connections, who'd been sufficiently impressed by the model's uncanny conversational authenticity to suggest Adam pursue it as an actual product. I asked him directly whether he had ever, at any point across those 3 years, considered simply asking me for consent to build this, whether as a personal project or eventually as a commercial one. He said he'd known, with increasing clarity as the project grew more serious and more commercially valuable, that I would likely say no, and that he'd made a conscious, deliberate decision to continue anyway rather than risk losing what he described, with a specific coldness that still unsettles me to recall, as the most valuable dataset I had access to. I asked him a second question that evening, one I hadn't fully planned to ask but that emerged almost involuntarily once the first admission had settled between us. I asked whether, during our actual engagement, during the specific conversations where we discussed our wedding, our future, the family we hoped to eventually build together, he had been thinking, even partially, about how those exact conversations might serve as valuable additional training data for his product. He was quiet for a long time before answering, longer than any other question I'd asked that evening, and told me, finally, that he honestly didn't know how to fully separate those two things anymore in his own memory, that somewhere across 3 years, his genuine feelings for me and his technical fascination with capturing those feelings as data had become, in his own account, difficult to fully distinguish from each other, even for him. I don't know that I'll ever find that answer satisfying or even fully comprehensible. But I've come to understand it as, in its own way, the most honest thing Adam said to me during that entire conversation, an admission that whatever love existed in our relationship had become, at some point I don't think even he can precisely date, inseparably entangled with a considerably colder, more extractive project running alongside it the entire time. The legal process that followed unfolded across several parallel tracks, reflecting the genuinely unusual, multi-layered nature of what Adam had done. The criminal wiretapping charges, based on the non-consensual audio recording Sandra's investigator had definitively documented, proceeded through our state's criminal justice system, ultimately resulting in Adam pleading guilty to a reduced set of charges given his lack of any prior criminal history, receiving a sentence involving probation and a formal criminal record for illegal electronic surveillance that will follow him for the remainder of his life. The civil case, pursued separately, addressed both the broader privacy violations involving my journal entries and general personal data, and a claim for the commercial value Adam had derived from using my personal data as the core asset of an actively funded startup venture. Sandra structured this claim around a theory of unjust enrichment, arguing successfully that Adam had built substantial commercial value, evidenced by real investor funding already secured, using an asset, my own private personality and conversational data, that he had no legal right to commercially exploit without my consent. The eventual settlement, reached after several months of negotiation, included substantial financial compensation reflecting a portion of the venture's assessed value at the time of discovery, alongside a legally binding requirement that Adam permanently destroy all training data, model weights, and any derivative products built using my personal information, verified through an independent technical audit Sandra's office commissioned specifically to confirm complete deletion rather than simply Adam's own unverified assurance that he'd done so. Sandra also negotiated a specific, forward-looking provision into the settlement that she described as unusually important given the technology involved, a binding commitment preventing Adam from developing any future AI product using any data derived, even indirectly, from our relationship, a provision designed to close off any possibility of Adam simply rebuilding some version of the same product under a different name or through a different technical approach once the immediate legal pressure had passed. She explained that without a provision like this, specifically tailored to the unique, ongoing risks posed by AI training data, a more conventional settlement might inadvertently leave room for exactly the kind of quiet, incremental reconstruction the underlying technology makes disturbingly possible. I learned, separately, that the specific angel investment firm that had frozen funding upon learning the truth ultimately pursued its own legal action against Adam directly, seeking to recover its initial investment based on the fraudulent misrepresentation regarding the training data's actual, consensual origin, a case that resolved, as far as I'm aware, with Adam returning a substantial portion of the initial investment funds, a financial consequence considerably beyond anything he'd anticipated when he'd first decided, 3 years earlier, to continue his private experiment without ever asking my permission. That I want to describe, in more detail, the specific process of verifying that Adam had actually completely destroyed the training data and model built from my personal information, because this part of the resolution mattered enormously to my own sense of closure, and because I think the specific technical mechanics are worth understanding for anyone who might eventually face something similar. Sandra's office retained an independent technical auditor, unaffiliated with either party, specifically tasked with verifying complete deletion rather than accepting Adam's own unverified assurance. That audit process took nearly 6 weeks, involving forensic examination of Adam's development servers, cloud storage accounts, and local devices, checking not just for the presence of the original files, but for cached copies, backup snapshots, and, critically, the trained model weights themselves, which the auditor explained could theoretically persist and remain functional even after the original raw training data had been deleted. The auditor's final report confirmed the original conversational transcripts, audio recordings, and journal entries had been deleted from all identified storage locations, and that the specific trained model versions built using that data had been permanently deleted as well, verified through a technical process the auditor described as checking for residual model checkpoint files across every backup and version control system Adam's development process had used. The report did note one important caveat that Sandra was careful to explain to me directly, that verifying the complete absence of any copy across every possible location, including any device or storage medium not disclosed during discovery, could never be established with absolute, 100% certainty, a limitation Sandra said was simply an unavoidable reality of this kind of digital forensic verification, rather than any specific failure in the audit process itself. I want to be honest that this caveat has remained a source of some lingering unease for me, even after the settlement concluded. I don't have absolute certainty that every trace of that model has been eliminated from existence. What I have is the most thorough, professionally verified confirmation currently possible, and I've had to make a specific, deliberate peace with that being enough, rather than continuing to search for a certainty that may simply not be fully achievable in a world where digital information can be so easily copied and hidden. That I want to address something I haven't yet fully described, which is the specific, unsettling capability of the actual AI model Adam had built, something I only fully understood once Sandra's technical investigator produced a detailed report analyzing exactly what Project Aria could do in its more developed, later versions. The model, by the time of its most recent iteration before the venture's collapse, was capable of generating conversational responses that closely mimicked my specific verbal patterns, emotional responses to particular topics, and even certain idiosyncratic phrases I use regularly without being consciously aware of them, patterns the model had apparently learned with a precision that unsettled even Sandra's own technical investigator, who described the output, in his written report, as remarkably convincing, in ways that exceeded what he'd generally expect from publicly available training methods at that time. I asked to see, and was eventually shown, under Sandra's careful supervision, a sample conversation log generated by an early version of the model, responding to a hypothetical prompt about a difficult day at work. Reading that generated response, in language that sounded disturbingly, specifically like something I would actually say, in a tone and rhythm I recognized as unmistakably my own, remains one of the more disorienting experiences of this entire ordeal, a strange, cold mirror reflecting back a version of myself I had never consented to have replicated at all, built entirely from years of vulnerability I'd shared believing it existed only between the two of us. Sandra's investigator explains something in his report that helped me understand, at least technically, why the model had become so specifically convincing. Unlike a general-purpose AI trained on broad internet text, Adam's model had been fine-tuned specifically and repeatedly on a narrow, deep dataset consisting almost entirely of my own actual language patterns, layered with detailed emotional context from the recordings and journal entries indicating which specific phrasings I tended to use during particular emotional states. This narrow, deep specialization, the investigator explained, was precisely what made the output feel so uncannily specific rather than generically human-like. It wasn't approximating a person in general. It was approximating me, specifically, trained on nothing else. I also learned, through this same technical report, that Adam had apparently tested later versions of the model on a small number of trusted friends without disclosing what it actually was, presenting it to them, according to messages the investigator recovered, as an AI chatbot demo, without specifying whose actual data it had been trained on. Several of those friends, according to their own responses preserved in that same message thread, had commented on how unusually natural and specific the model's responses felt compared to other AI products they tried. Comments Adam had apparently saved and referenced directly in his eventual investor pitch materials as informal validation of the product's core value proposition. That I want to talk briefly about the process of explaining what happened to friends and family who had known Adam and me as an engaged couple for years, a conversation complicated considerably by how technical and, to many people, initially difficult to fully grasp the actual violation was. My mother's first reaction, understandably, focused primarily on the recordings and the cancelled wedding, the parts of this story that mapped most directly onto categories of betrayal she already had some frame of reference for. It took considerably longer, in subsequent conversations, for her to fully grasp the additional, separate violation of the commercial AI product itself, that Adam hadn't simply invaded my privacy for some strange, contained personal reason, but had built an actual, fundable business whose core value proposition depended on that invasion. Several friends, particularly those with their own technical or software industry backgrounds, understood the full scope and severity of what Adam had done considerably faster than friends without that context, several of them independently raising, unprompted, exactly the kind of data consent and AI training concerns that had become increasingly prominent in broader public conversation around AI development during roughly the same period all of this was happening. I found a specific, unexpected comfort in those conversations, understanding that what happened to me wasn't simply an isolated, personal betrayal, but connected to a genuinely significant, broader cultural reckoning already underway around consent and personal data in an era of increasingly powerful AI systems. My friend Priya, in particular, the same friend I'd once told about how, emotionally present, Adam seemed during our difficult conversations, took the news especially hard, telling me she felt a specific, retroactive guilt over having repeatedly praised exactly the quality that had apparently, at least in part, been serving Adam's data collection the entire time. I told her, and I meant it genuinely, that she had no reason to carry that guilt. Neither of us had any way of knowing what was actually happening beneath the surface of what looked, from every visible angle, like a genuinely attentive, present partner. I've had to remind myself of that same thing more times than I can count since, understanding that the specific skill of appearing attentive while extracting is precisely what makes this kind of violation so difficult for anyone, including the person living inside it, to detect in real time. That I want to describe, separately, the specific, logistical heartbreak of canceling a wedding that had been fully planned and largely paid for months before its scheduled date, because it added its own distinct layer of grief to everything else I was simultaneously processing. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd eventually confront Adam weeks later, making a list of vendors to contact, the venue, the caterer, the photographer, the string quartet we'd booked for the ceremony itself, each phone call requiring me to explain, in some minimal, sanitized version, that the wedding was no longer happening, without being able to fully articulate the actual, bizarre reason why. Several vendors were kind and accommodating, offering partial refunds or credit toward future events. Others, bound by strict cancellation policies we'd agreed to months earlier under entirely different circumstances, retained significant deposits I had no legal grounds to recover, deposits that became, eventually, a specific line item in the financial damages Sandra included in our broader civil case against Adam. I found myself, during that specific week of vendor calls, grieving not just the relationship itself, but the entire, detailed future I'd spent over a year planning in granular, hopeful detail, a future that had, I now understood, been quietly generating additional training data for a commercial AI product the entire time I'd been building it, believing completely that Adam and I were building it together, for exactly the reasons it appeared we were. I've spent considerable time since this entire ordeal trying to understand what specifically made this particular betrayal feel so uniquely disorienting compared to more conventional forms of infidelity or deception I might have more readily understood. I think the answer is that most betrayals, however painful, at least involve a recognizable emotional logic. Infidelity happens because of unmet needs or attraction to someone else. Financial deception happens out of greed or desperation. What Adam did operated according to a considerably colder, more calculating logic, one where my own vulnerability and trust functioned, throughout our entire relationship, as a valuable technical resource being systematically extracted and refined, even during the exact same conversations where I believed we were building genuine intimacy together. I've also had to sit with a specific, ongoing uncertainty I don't think will ever fully resolve. The question of how much of Adam's apparent attentiveness and presence throughout our relationship was genuine partnership, and how much was, even partially, the specific behavior of someone actively, methodically extracting rich, detailed training data from every vulnerable conversation we ever had. I don't think that question has a clean, satisfying answer, and I've had to learn, slowly, to live inside that uncertainty rather than force it into a resolution the actual evidence doesn't fully support either way. I've found, oddly, some measure of processing through conversations with a therapist who specializes, somewhat unusually, in what she describes as technology-enabled relational trauma, a category she told me has become considerably more common in her practice over just the past few years as AI tools have become more sophisticated and more woven into daily life. She helped me understand that my specific disorientation, grieving a relationship while simultaneously questioning its underlying authenticity, doesn't require me to resolve exactly how much of it was real before I'm allowed to grieve it fully. She suggested that Adam's own feelings for me and his extractive data collection likely coexisted, messily, the entire time, in a way psychology doesn't yet have a fully satisfying framework for, given how new this specific category of violation actually is. I think, often, about a broader question this entire experience has forced me to sit with, one I don't think has an easy answer even setting aside my own specific situation. As AI systems become increasingly capable of learning from, and replicating, deeply personal human data, what does genuine consent actually require in a relationship where one partner has both the technical capability and the ongoing access necessary to quietly, gradually build something like what Adam built? I don't have a clean answer to that question. I'm not sure anyone fully does yet, given how recently this specific category of technology, and the specific category of violation it enables, has actually become possible at all. That I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone should distrust a partner's genuine attentiveness, or that AI development itself is inherently predatory. Most people building AI products do so with genuine consent processes and legitimate training data. What happened to me was the result of one specific person's deliberate, sustained decision to treat my own private vulnerability as an extractable resource, compounded by years of active concealment from both me and, ultimately, his own business partners and investors. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, particularly as AI products become an increasingly ordinary part of daily life, it's a new, unfortunately necessary kind of awareness. Understand what data any technology in your life, including a partner's personal projects, might actually be collecting, and don't assume good intentions are a substitute for explicit, informed consent, especially once real money and real commercial incentives enter the picture. I got a legal acknowledgement that what happened to me was a genuine violation, not something I was overreacting to. I got confirmation that the specific model built from my own private life has been permanently destroyed, verified independently rather than simply taken on faith. What I can't fully get back is the specific, uncomplicated trust one once had in my own private vulnerability actually staying private, a trust I'm still, slowly, learning how to rebuild with anyone new I eventually choose to share my life with again. I think, often, about a specific detail from the technical audit that I haven't yet mentioned, one that has stayed with me more than almost anything else from this entire process. The auditor's report noted that the very last training update to Adam's model had occurred just 11 days before I discovered the folder, meaning that up until nearly the moment I found everything, Adam had still been actively, ongoingly incorporating our most recent conversations into his product, presumably including conversations about our upcoming wedding itself. I don't think there's a clean way to fully process that specific detail. I've simply had to learn to hold it, the way I've had to learn to hold so much of this entire experience, without needing it to resolve into something more comfortable than it actually is. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that something you shared in complete trust was being used in a way you never consented to, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned navigating trust in an increasingly digital world, every week.